This video is made possible by Olly, unlimited data for Japan in seconds. More on that in a moment. From the famous Nintendo NES to the PlayStation, and taking us through legendary sagas such as Super Mario Bros., Zelda, Final Fantasy, or even Dark Souls, Japan has become a mecca of video games. This sector represents almost 3% of all exports from the land of the rising sun. In this industry, it has come to rival the United States. Despite having only a third of its population, the importance of its video game industry has been such that between 2005 and 2010, for instance, 35 of the 100 best-selling video games in the US were of Japanese origin. That's crazy. Basically, Japan's success is so great that we almost take it for granted. The earth is round, the sky is blue, and of course, Japan tops the world of video games. That's nothing new. Even so, in all this, there is something that doesn't seem to quite fit, and that is Japan is actually a nation not so much given to leisure and entertainment. Its long and tedious working hours are well known all over the world. Its hierarchical, strict, and disciplined culture seems anything but close to the world of video games. In the political arena, well, what can I say? Japan was one of the great enemies of the United States during World War II, and after the war, naturally, things were not in a very good shape. Its economy in the mid-20th century was pretty weak, so catapulting into technological stardom driven by video games didn't exactly seem like the clearest path in the world. Nevertheless, in spite of everything, there it is. Japan became, without a doubt, the absolute king of video games. The question is, why? How did Japan become the star of the video game? What made it surpass other countries? What does its culture and economic model have to do with all this? Well, today on Visualeconomik, we tell you all about it. Let's get into it. If we want to understand Japan's success, it's best to start at the beginning. And in this case, that beginning is the end of World War II. As we've said, Japan was the big loser of the Second World War. 2 nuclear bombs, a slaughtered military, and a depressed economy. The country was seemed doomed to disaster. However, nothing could be further from the truth. Contrary to all expectations, Japan was reborn like a phoenix. In other words, in just 20 years after World War II, Japan went from being a massacred and decimated country to surpassing even megapowers such as the United Kingdom. Companies such as Sony, Nikon, Mitsubishi, and Toyota began to dominate world markets, and the Japanese economy became highly specialized in the technology sector, with the video game sector being a good example of this process. But how did a devastated country become one of the world's leading technological and economic powers? Well, the origin of everything lies in the US occupation. You see, following the war and the defeat of the Japanese Empire, the country was occupied militarily and politically by the United States. And the funny thing is that the soldiers who occupied Japan brought with them something that would be fundamental to the foundation of the Japanese video game industry. Here we are talking about arcade game machines like the one you are seeing on the screen. These machines were used like primitive video games that soldiers used in their free time to entertain themselves. The point is that in order to play these machines, the soldiers needed to import them from the United States. And not surprisingly, importing was expensive, slow, and a really complicated process. So the Japanese came up with a business model. Companies like Sega began copying American arcade machines to sell to soldiers at reduced prices. In that sense, and a little later on, the Japanese also began to copy American video games, such as Atari's Pong in 1972. And let's just say that little by little, the Japanese industry entered the technology and entertainment market thanks to its ability to imitate. But how was Japan able to copy US technology so successfully? Well, one of the keys to success was that the video games of the time were not software recorded on a floppy disk or CDs that ran on a computer, but were programmed directly into the electronic circuits of the game machines themselves. And because of this, the Japanese had a great advantage over the US. Due to its cheap labor force and its close relationship with the American power, Japan was developing a powerful semiconductor manufacturing industry. So when arcade games became popular, Japan already had the tools to copy them. But pay attention here because although at the beginning, Japanese companies only copied. They quickly began to develop their own video games. A famous example of this is Space Invaders from 1978. Indeed, we're talking about the iconic game of the Little Martians that was a revolution in the industry. Be that as it may, the key to this whole matter is that the companies that started developing video games in Japan had one peculiarity that made them unique. These companies traditionally belonged to traditional entertainment sectors, such as the makers of board games. However, the US companies were technology companies that started making video games exclusively. But do you want an example? There is none better than Nintendo itself. Founded in 1889, Nintendo was dedicated to manufacturing card games and various toys. But with the video game boom, Nintendo also joined the group of companies dedicated to manufacturing these little machines for American soldiers. So when the video game boom arrived, Nintendo not only had experience in the manufacture of electronic products, but also had a lot of experience in the development of traditional games. This factor gave them a huge advantage over American companies. The Japanese had mastered entertainment over a long time, and perhaps that is why it took them very little time to master electronic entertainment. Of course, there are exceptions to all this. Sony, the company behind the PlayStation, was originally a manufacturer of home appliances, not toys. But hold on a minute, because to begin with, Sony didn't just manufacture household appliances, it also had a very important branch dedicated to innovation. This led to inventions such as the legendary Walkman. But the most relevant thing is that Sony focused on hardware development, leaving the task of designing video games to other companies. In other words, Sony was one of the first companies to limit itself exclusively to building a console and left the game section to external producers. To give some figures, third parties, that is, video games developed by companies other than the one that designed their console, represented 80% of the games on Sega's Saturn. But in the case of Sony's PlayStation, that figure reached 95%. The question is, why was making only one console and leaving video games to third parties an advantage for Sony? Well, we can find at least a couple of reasons. The first is that this reduced the costs for independent developers. These developers could concentrate on making their video games without having to sell their own consoles, since they could design the games for the PlayStation. But the second is that having a console like the PlayStation, which was affordable and compatible with most video games, could greatly increase the available supply of video games. That not only served to boost the industry, but it was a great business gamble, which Sony could earn huge amounts of money thanks to the commissions it charged for the sale of the numerous video games offered for the console. In short, it was a profitable business. In any case, in this whole story, there is one last factor that could be even more important than the ones already mentioned. Japan already had an existing cultural base that was quite compatible with the video game industry. We're talking about manga and anime. In the West, we could say that manga is a relatively new thing, but in Japan, it has been a cultural success since the middle of last century. As with video games, it was initially heavily influenced by the US, and particularly by Disney. In fact, it is said that Osamu Tezuka, the founding father of manga, watched the Bambi movie more than 130 times. Whatever the case, the fact is that the video game industry needs a lot of artistic staff, both for the creative part of the designs and for drawing the backgrounds and animating the characters. Shigeru Miyamoto, the father of Super Mario Bros., presided over his high school manga club, and Akira Toriyama, the author of the legendary Dragon Ball, participated in the video game industry by designing monsters for the Dragon Quest saga, one of the biggest Japanese role-playing games, or RPGs. In other words, basically, video game developers already had a very large number of workers who could switch industries without any problem. And if that wasn't enough, the video game industry paid much higher salaries than the manga and animation industry, which allowed it to bring in thousands of workers. But there is something else. It's not just that video games absorbed workers from the manga and anime world, but that their relationship was much more cooperative. Soon, video game developers began to hire animation studios to create manga or anime to promote their video games. As a result, both industries benefited from each other, thereby helping to improve the competitiveness of the entire Japanese entertainment sector. And if you want an example, think of Pokemon. First, it was was a video game, and then came the series, the card games, the decks, and before you know it, Pokemon is in your soup. But apart from theory, what specific events made Japan take the global video game market by storm? How did all the ideas we've mentioned materialize into concrete products? Well, today on Visualeconomik, we tell you all about it. And naturally, with everything we are going to tell you about the great Japanese power, you will probably want to travel there and make the most of this experience. If so, don't forget your data connectivity. In our day-to-day lives, we use many applications, from Google Maps to Instagram, and when traveling, we tend to increase our usage. That's why it's essential to have an internet connection plan that offers ease of use and security in the connection, without breaking the bank with excessive roaming charges. Well, in that case, I have excellent news for you. Thanks to Olly, on your next trip, you won't need to spend a fortune on international roaming services in order to stay connected. You will be able to take full advantage of technology with Olly's eSIM digital SIM card. With this card, you can purchase your mobile data plan immediately in more than 170 countries without interruption, even with unlimited data, without relying on Wi-Fi or expensive roaming fees. You can enter their app or website and select the plan that best suits your needs. After that, you only have to install the Olly International eSIM with a QR code, and that's it. You will instantly be able to discover the best places in Japan and share them with your family and friends using the network, as well as contact them and enjoy all the internet services. Don't miss a single detail of Japan and learn more about Olly and the digital SIM cards for travel with unlimited data. We'll leave you a link in the description. And now let's continue with Japan and its formidable video game industry.
Plumber to the rescue.
To understand the events that catapulted Japanese companies to fame, we must first understand the context of video games in the 1980s. Technology had improved a lot. Video games were no longer arcade games that had to be programmed directly on the circuits of large machines, but were now on computers and consoles in every home. Even so, Visualeconomik viewers, these technological advances did not bring about great improvements in video games as a whole. In fact, it was quite the opposite. By making the development of consoles and video games much more accessible, the market was flooded with video games of a very low quality. Keep in mind that at the time, there were hardly any video game magazines, let alone review websites, so people were buying almost blindly. Of course, on top of all this, pirating became much easier. In fact, it is estimated that pirated copies were 10 times more numerous than legal ones. And as you can imagine, no company was willing to make a big investment to design and create a super game that everyone was going to pirate. Well, when it seemed that things could not get any worse, one of the worst incidents in the history of video games occurred: the launch of the E.T. game. To cut a long story short, this was the most expensive game ever created, largely due to the cost of royalties. However, it ended up being such a disaster that they had to bury hundreds of thousands of unsold copies in a landfill. Not surprisingly, the fact that E.T., the biggest bet in the industry, turned out to be such a huge failure made people lose faith in video games. To put it into figures, in 1 year, video game sales fell from $3 billion to just $100 million. That's 30 times left. Atari, the developer of the E.T. video game, went bankrupt, but it took many other companies along with it. And it was in this context that salvation came from the least expected place. Can you guess how? In the same year as the video game crash, Nintendo released its Famicom console, better known in the West as the NES. Following the philosophy we explained before, the NES looks more like a toy than a console. Unlike the competition, it did not have a keyboard, but a controller with a couple of very large buttons. Well, the number of sales recorded by this console was unprecedented. The NES took the market by storm, but that's not all. If the console was a success, its star video game, Super Mario Bros., was even more so. While a regular game sold a few thousand copies, Super Mario sold more than 6 million in Japan alone. Don't think that Nintendo's success was solely about launching a good game and a good console. Not at all. What Nintendo did was to set a very high quality standard for video games that wanted to be published on its consoles. On top of that, it made sure that they eliminated references to alcohol or sex, orienting the industry towards a more family-friendly side, something that the video game industry needed at that time, and badly.
Video games encourage juvenile delinquency and hinder healthy development. Japan National Police Agency, 1981.
During the 1980s, many countries passed laws to restrict teenagers' access to video games, particularly arcade games. But thanks to Nintendo, popular opinion on this issue softened. And of course, after the success of the NES, Sony launched the PlayStation. The launch of the PlayStation in 1994, a decade after the NES, was another unprecedented success. Unlike the competition, which used cartridges, the PlayStation used CDs, which allowed longer games in which more complex stories could be developed. The Final Fantasy saga is a clear example of this. From that moment on, Japan completely dominated the world of consoles. The next big global success was the PlayStation 2, and later, the Wii, also from Nintendo. In short, Japan succeeded in video games because it had a very solid industrial and cultural base, and above all, because it knew how to take advantage of a critical moment in order to take the lead. And you know the saying, once a boxer, always a boxer. From this point on, the Japanese companies just had to let the snowball roll. With such a head start, no one could take the crown away from the land of the rising sun, or so many people thought around the year 2000. However, things are never that simple, and now it seems that Japan could be in for a rough decline. Listen up.
The fall of Japan.
I want you to pay close attention to the following graph. In 2000, Japan had a video game industry larger than that of Europe and similar to that of the United States. However, while the latter two continued to grow, the Japanese industry remained stagnant. This happened because the Japanese market became increasingly irrelevant, and it was the software that gained importance. To give you an idea, in the 80s, the ratio between the size of the hardware industry, that is consoles, and the software industry, that is video games cartridges, was 1:1. However, just a decade later, the ratio became 2:4, and by 1996, it was 3:2. As you can imagine, this gap continued to grow over time, so that dominating console manufacturing was no longer synonymous with dominating the video game market. But that's not all. If you recall, we started this video by telling you how Japan dominated the top 100 best-selling games in the US. Even so, this dominance has plummeted. The reason? The reason is that the genres that are the most popular in Europe and the US, such as shooting or sports games, are quite unpopular in Japan, where RPGs have always been more popular. This has made it very difficult for Japan to release large mega productions beyond very famous sagas such as Final Fantasy, or typical Nintendo games like Zelda or Mario. These games are so expensive to produce that in order to be profitable, they have to sell very well worldwide. But Japanese developers, heavily influenced by their domestic market, don't make that many games that are popular overseas. Japanese companies are fully aware of this problem, and in recent years, more and more of them are approaching the West. Perhaps the clearest example is the Final Fantasy saga, an icon of Japanese RPG that, in its latest installments, has opted to change the turn-based combat system for an action combat one, more attuned to Western audiences. Will it work out well? Well, that remains to be seen. But at this point, we hand the questions over to you. Do you remember any Japanese video games from your childhood? Which factors do you think were most decisive in the rise of the Japanese industry, economic or cultural ones? Do you think Japan will succeed in regaining its strength in the sector? You can leave me your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you liked the video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best, see you soon.